April 10th, 2016. Okay, this was a expose, exposing Fort Detrick for what it was. And it ended with the same thing, that they were going to be reaching out to Congress and the whole thing. And it just obviously nothing happened, because we know that it was later again shut down for containment issues. Meanwhile, these people we're going to talk about today, who were all reportedly being sick way back then and all the way before then too, they just got dismissed and they refused to comment and said nothing's wrong. And then they had containment issues in 2019. So it just has to be obvious that they don't really care about the actual problems that are happening around the things that they're doing. They care about covering them up and suppressing them. And we have to realize that this, at the very least, is something that we need to consider in regard to what's going on today. Now, we'll play the clips for you, and we'll talk about it a little bit more. I played you a small part to open today, but this isn't the full video. Again, I hope you watch the full video, but these are the parts that I felt were relevant for you today.
I visited the town of Frederick, Maryland, which is just outside of Washington, D.C., and met a lot of people who were suffering or had family members who had died from rare illnesses. And one thing they all had in common was a theory that the source of these rare illnesses was a local army base called Fort Detrick and some of the secret activities that have been going on there for decades.
I lived on Elm Street, and on the side of the road that I lived on, just counting the 6 houses, everyone had cancer.
So my daughter, at the age of 28 years old, was diagnosed with brain cancer. Then my second daughter gets sick and has tumors in her womb, and they said that this was not genetic but environmental. About a year after that, my wife then gets renal cell carcinoma and dies a year later after that. We have over 1,300 documented cancer victims right now, just in a 1-mile radius. I'll be quite honest with you, it's changed my life so radically, sometimes I don't even know who I am.
1,300 people in a 1-mile radius. And what's causing so much sickness? It turns out all these victims have one thing in common. They live next to a military base called Fort Detrick.
In historic Frederick, Maryland, are the biological warfare laboratories. The volunteers have been positioned on the outside of the test sphere, in which a cloud of biological warfare agent can be generated.
In 2009, Fort Detrick was added to the EPA's Superfund priority list, making Area B, located here, one of the most polluted places in the nation, just across the street from this crowded neighborhood.
We don't drink our tap water.
Who told you that you couldn't drink?
Nobody said you're not allowed to, but it's kind of just a general, known thing in my neighborhood that we don't drink the tap water.
And why is that?
Because we know there's chemicals there.
Because they know that there's chemicals there. And by the way, that's something that they aggressively deny. Meanwhile, they're actually delivering water, on the record, by the way, to numerous people in this neighborhood. This was back in 2016. They're delivering water to these people while simultaneously maintaining that there's nothing wrong with the water. Go ahead and work that one out for yourself. Yeah, this is the same government that we know has lied to us about any number of things throughout history that allowed people to die. Let's pretend like they would never do something like that. Test and rather just conduct themselves in ways that they know isn't affecting the environment around them and just not care about that. By the way, there's examples of that all around the world. Any U.S. military base around the world, you will find obvious examples of horrifying environmental disaster taking place in these bases. Some of the worst in the world, matter of fact, and they just deny it or don't care about it because it's not their territory, even though they're occupying it. But recognize the territory we're talking about there. This is Fort Detrick. This is the same location that was shut down in 2019 for containment issues, which then followed by this mysterious vaping illness and a couple of other places on the other side that had weird flu-like symptoms that they just ignored and had all the same symptoms, by the way, all around Fort Detrick, all with the exact same ground glass opacity in the lungs, which, by the way, is the exact same symptoms we're seeing today. All of that happened. It was all dismissed. No actual evidence. They said, we think it's vaping. And they tried to saddle it with the THC cartridges, but by the way, so you know, that was never verified. That's why it's the mysterious vaping illness. That was theories, which something that should be looked into. I think we can all agree. Yet that's been dismissed left and right. No one cares to look at that. Now, that's just the part we're talking about in 2019. This video is talking about 2016 and before, all the way back to when it first opened. And it's been continuing. And you're talking about an entire community of people around this that just know, well, we can't drink the water because there's chemicals in it. Well, let's just, for sake of conversation, or rather let's just assume that they're chemicals and not something much more worrisome. But we know that it's happening. We know that people are concerned. We know that people have a very clear understanding of what's going on there. And we still don't care to think about it. I think we need to ask ourselves why that is and how that's something that even makes sense in regard to what we're dealing with today. Again, I hope you watch the full video because there's plenty more to get into in this. But here's something to look at. Now, I've been talking about this vaping discussion. Now, I want to be very clear. I feel like I was clear on this in the past, but I feel like some people have still misunderstood. I am no way suggesting that vaping is somehow the cause of what's happening. It could be. I'm not saying that anything's possible, but there's no evidence to suggest that. For some reason, I feel like people have taken that as what I'm suggesting is that this vaping connection is somehow responsible for it. It's, in my opinion, a cover-up. The vaping aspect is what was used to cover up what was potentially coronavirus happening in 2019 in the United States. That's what I thought. That's my theory on this, and that's what seems logical based on all of the evidence. The same exact symptoms, the same exact response, everything about it. Tied to Fort Detrick that was working on coronavirus is tied with bats, which is the same exact strain that we're now finding out is in existence today. All of these things tie back exactly. So this graph is talking about, this is actually from a German, German group that released the data. I also have from other sources, which I'll show you. But this is about pneumonia, or rather ILI, influenza-like illnesses. And this is specifically about pneumonia. And rather, this one is the whole category, but it still shows you that reporting in general is pretty much the same all the way up until 2019, 2020, which is now. And for whatever reason, that number of reported influenza-like illnesses is really low and continuing to drop. You know, almost as if it's not being reported properly, almost as if it's something else. And you could look at it either way. Right? That people would argue that this is a cover-up trying to deny it's that. Some people would argue they're basically using pneumonia cases to make coronavirus look worse. Right? People argue from both sides of this. But the bottom line, and really what this show is about, is to bring you the data for you to come to your own conclusions. There's a lot of people out there trying to, pretend. I'm even seeing a lot of channels that have never said it before be like, question, guys, think for yourself, come to your own conclusions. I'm like, gee, where'd you get that from? The same people then go on to forcefully tell you what's true and this is what's happening, right? You can't say think for yourself and then, basically force you into a certain discussion and tell you this is what's happening. It's because people know that that's something people are looking for today. People that aren't forcefully telling you what to think, like the mainstream media. There's a lot of it out there today. But the point is, this is evidence, it's data. So you need to recognize at the very least, whether it's more or less, whatever, that there's something off about this. And here's a more specific one. This is just pneumonia deaths. Look at how obvious that is. In a general sense, also notice that it's kind of increasingly gone down, even though it's been getting worse. Right? Let me explain what I'm saying there. So if you're looking at you're looking at the graphs. Okay, you can see that the colors go from 2013 all the way to 2020, red being current. Now you'll notice that, you can go from the orange that seems to be the highest, and the numbers just kind of slowly seem to drop a little bit. Again, the point being, and that's over the years, even though we've gotten increased severity of our influenza season during those years. So how does that make sense, first of all? And on top of that, the real point, that this year, starting exactly on the beginning of January, that's right where that big drop starts, seemingly right when this was happening, seemingly right when Azar was saying, Trump, let's talk about coronavirus. And he said, I only want to talk about vaping. Remember that? We just talked about that. And it just drops and drops and drops. Now, how in the world, in the middle of an influenza-like pandemic, which literally causes pneumonia, would the pneumonia cases be going down so much? Now, somebody might argue, well, it's because they're just, it's all coronavirus. But that doesn't make sense, seeing as how there are also just pneumonia cases that are also happening, as well as the fact that some people also just have pneumonia. So you could either argue that they're just saying it's all coronavirus, even though they may just have it and actually are dying from pneumonia. Any number of things you could look at. The bottom line is this isn't right. There is something being covered up here. That's very odd to me. And I think the fact that there's the odd timing of it on January 1st has to say something to you. Now you can see how this progressed, as we've been talking about. of course, as I accidentally close the tab, the mysterious, that's weird. Had it open before, and now it's not letting me do it. Hold on a second. Very odd. I have to go to my incognito window so you can see it, apparently. I'm not sure why it showed up before without looking at that. Here we go. The mysterious vaping illness that's become an epidemic. An epidemic, right? That sounds very serious. This is back on August 31st, 2019, and then weirdly updated on September 11th. Take it for what you will. August 31st. And by the way, that what you're looking at right there in the picture, yeah, that's what's called the ground glass opacity. That's what they're talking about. By the way, they don't name it that here, even though that's exactly what it is, and you can find it related to all these vaping illnesses have been shown to have the exact same thing, the exact same, E-Valley, the acronym they use, the type of the thing they're calling this vaping mysterious illness. It had the ground glass opacity in the lungs, which is the supposedly rare thing we're seeing only with coronavirus. Yet this was happening all the way back in August of August 31st, 2019. Now, let's keep going. Get back on the regular screen. Here is one from September 26, 2019. 2,291 sick. Do you remember hearing about that? 48 dead from mysterious vaping illness. Now, this was discussed. People were talking about the vaping thing, but imagine if this was instead a virus. And you're talking about 48 dead. You realize how this has only been going on for a month or more that we've really been talking about it? And there's almost 2,500 people sick, almost 50 dead. I mean, that was faster than we were talking about coronavirus, and yet nobody was panicking at this point. But ask yourself why this wasn't being discussed and how in the world this was happening to the level of severity we're talking about, and they still didn't know what it was, even though we'd already had discussions of people from China reaching out and saying, this looks like coronavirus. And they just ignored it and shut down the conversation. Here's October. We're going month to month here. This was not some passing thing. Scientists chase cause of mysterious vaping illness as death toll rises. This was month after month after month of people dying, of people getting sick, of spreading. And then it just stopped being talked about as they shifted in the statistics into something else. Here's November. U.S. health officials make breakthrough in mysterious vaping illness. Now, that breakthrough was when they just said, we think it was these THC cartridges, and had nothing that actually backed that up. No actual evidence to support the claim this was some kind of synthetic THC thing that was somehow spreading like a virus, right? Remember how they reported these as clusters. How in the world can you spread this this is a vaping illness, correct? As they're calling it. How can it spread like a virus? Even their own language was discussing this like a virus. Here we are in December, month by month, mystery, deadly illness linked to vaping. Right, guys, this was every single month they were keeping this rolling. Nobody seemed to care enough to do anything about it. People are still dying from mysterious vaping illness, even as outbreak slows. Interesting. Now, how does that make sense, right? I mean, obviously, the point is that this is not what actually happened. See, people continued. The sickness increased, as we can actually see with the influenza, grading of the state's coloring by the CDC. It got worse. So what actually happened right there? Did they actually stop happening, or did they just suddenly start shifting these things into other categories? Either way, you can't ignore the kind of thing we're talking about at Fort Detrick, right? This video is 2016, but the leak we're talking about was 2019, exactly before this all started. I'm talking right before we got to here. And suddenly, it continues and it continues and it continues all the way up until January, to when they just stopped talking about it. And remember, this is when suddenly the numbers started shifting down. It's almost like it adds up, but almost like it perfectly connects, right? It's how crazy. And then suddenly we get into the territory of, the Wuhan military games and the progression into China. It's hard to miss this stuff. Now, here is the world map, as you can see, of the reported cases. Now, it seems to be almost like a little pattern. Like you can almost kind of see like a path. But you know, then that would make sense in regard to how a virus might spread. But here's an interesting thought for you, especially right before we get into the discussion of hiding things and then again get eventually into the Spanish flu discussion. Here's a thought for you on how these things have happened in the past, usually following, military and, large groupings of people. Here is U.S. military bases worldwide, but this is from 2001, 2003. It was actually quite difficult, surprisingly enough. It's almost like they don't want you knowing where their bases are today to find current data. But nonetheless, here's 2001, 2003. Here's one from 2016, I believe. Pretty much the same thing. Generally the same with a little bit of scattering, right? So here is, again, the world image. Now take a look at this and tell me what this looks like to you. Tell me what this seems to show you. Now, please recognize that this is in no way proof of anything. Correlation is not causation. But it comes a point when you have so many data points, so many obvious correlations, that you need to begin to ask certain questions. Now, if we're staring at the red being all of the U.S. military bases around the world and all of the dots on the map being all the coronavirus cases, it's really hard to ignore a very close correlation with pretty much anywhere the U.S. military is present in the world. It's kind of hard to miss that, right? Now, it's not exact, obviously, because things can spread in their own way. But it's kind of hard to miss that it seems to be the focal points seem to be exactly where the focal points of U.S. military presence are. At the very least, you can see that this seems predominantly in the western parts of the countries, even though they're basically, look at Africa, for instance. Right? There was this discussion that I haven't even noted on where French doctors were literally saying, let's go test these things on Africans because they don't care. They have nothing to lose, right? Because these people are just useless and meaningless, right? That was the sentiment, which is pretty damn disgusting when you think about it. When you don't even think about them, it's disgusting. That's just bad. Those are bad people. Let's just go test these things that could kill people because we don't care about them. But it's really hard to miss the correlation, and I'm hoping people begin to think about this kind of stuff. I actually saw another interesting maps on High Impact Flicks, I believe, in regard to even like a 5G correlation with maps, and any one of them could just be coincidence. But it's important for you to think about these things and to ask questions. Because simply suggesting that this is even in any way tied to the U.S. military, despite the historical precedent and despite evidence pointing in that direction, not proof, but evidence, people will just lose their minds. People will just flip out and call you some kind of propagandist or a shill because you dare to actually consider alternative theories. Not say this is what happened, but just consider information. If anybody out there is shouting you down for just considering something other than what they're saying, you should stop listening to that person. You should recognize that they are the one that's blinded. Even if you're both wrong, or it doesn't matter. If you're willing to ignore information because you've already been told you're not supposed to look at it, or that's just not true without ever actually being objective and looking over the data, then you're lying to yourself. Or they are, the people are, who are doing such things. Now, moving forward, with that in mind, with the obvious correlation between where the U.S. military is around the world and where these things have seemed to have popped up. Coming from Zero Heads, a shocking expose proves thousands of COVID-19 deaths have gone uncounted in the United States. So again, the reality, and this is coming from New York Times, so for all we know, it could be some massive propaganda push. But the reality is that it seems pretty clear this is kind of happening all over the world right now, which again ties in with the same thing that happened during the Spanish flu. That China's hiding what the real situation is, that Italy's hiding what the real situation is, that Iran is hiding what the real situation is, that the U.S. is very clearly hiding what the real situation is. So it's not, when we're talking about these things, especially when we're someone like myself, who is working inside the United States and who is actively and constantly trying to change the government in this country for the better, well, this is where our content seems to focus. So it's kind of crazy especially when it seems to be the most prominent people doing the worst things around the world. It's interesting how people will criticize people like myself for only seeming to talk about the government that they're currently being oppressed by. It doesn't make any, why don't you talk about this country and what they're doing? It's because I'm in this country, guys. Even though I do, as you know, to the people out there, talk about everything around the world as best I can. Point being, we can clearly see that cases have been manipulated here. Even talking back to Mr. Redford saying that they had documented cases that were diagnosed as the flu in this country. That was way back in the beginning of this whole thing. Now, this says 2 reporters from the New York Times purport to have found evidence that health officials, often at the local or county level, are dramatically undercounting coronavirus deaths in the U.S., citing information and documents provided by doctors, hospital officials, public health experts, and medical examiners, among others. The reporters claim that potentially thousands of deaths have gone uncounted, meaning the total is probably closer to 20K or beyond. The first inclination I have when reading from the mainstream media is wondering, how are they trying to trick me? Right? So it's coming from the New York Times. I would ask myself, maybe they're trying to hype the numbers, which is something, it is whether or not, both are happening. We need to make sure we understand that. There are places where things are trying to be hidden, and there are absolutely places where they're trying to be hyped, because they both serve agendas. Right now, clearly, hyping up the numbers serves to help push in all these agendas. So to make it seem like it's worse than it is, well, that would make sense. But I'm not saying it's not true. I'm just saying we need to question it like everything else. But the point is, I think we have to be very clear that on cases that have gone uncounted in this country, but that does not immediately translate that it's worse than we're being told. Because recognize, if what we're talking about is even slightly correct, that this was happening in the U.S. as well as many other countries before 2020, then that very clearly shows us that it wasn't as severe as we're being told, because people weren't keeling over in the streets during 2019. Because it wasn't being checked, people weren't taking actions, they weren't trying to lessen the curve, right? And people weren't just falling over and dropping dead in the streets. So that would prove to us that it wasn't as severe if it was happening before. And I really do think it was. I mean, we're getting the data from Italy, we're getting the data from South Korea, we're getting multiple nations, U.S. allies, have said that they're seeing the same exact thing, that this was starting before that. And yet, for some reason, the mainstream media will not drop the narrative. That shows you that there's an agenda that they've already locked into. They probably didn't expect for us to be this far ahead of the story at this point. So they're forcing it in. From Moon of Alabama, U.S. will cover up its own coronavirus death toll. There's a lot of ways that this could go. And I mean, even just the title, you would think that's pretty clear. But again, people will go, you could say they're covering it up by making it less, or you could say they're covering it up by making it more and it doesn't exist. Right? It's very interesting how there's a lot of theories flying around. No, most of them today are so unwilling to consider the other side, when really it's usually somewhere in the middle and neither of them. And those groupings that are so hell-bent on their one theory are usually the left-right paradigm, the people that are completely lost to the political sides of all of this and refuse to look at anything else. Now, on March 21st, the Daily Beast reported an upcoming propaganda campaign that the White House was launching against China. Now, I didn't see this Daily Beast article, and I wish this was back in end of March. But this is pretty interesting to think about. The Daily Beast is reporting on an upcoming, they obtained information about an upcoming propaganda campaign against China. It reads, as the number of coronavirus cases, and this I think it's March 26th, as the number of coronavirus cases continues to grow at a rapid pace in the U.S., the White House is launching a communications plan across multiple federal agencies that focuses on accusing Beijing of orchestrating a cover-up and creating a global pandemic, according to 2 U.S. officials and a government cable obtained by the Daily Beast. So they literally outline, here's how we're going to lie. Here's how we're going to manipulate. They always do this. Just like with the Which Path to Persia document, they always outline these things that they're planning on doing. Right? So they're literally writing down that we're going to try to manipulate the narrative. We're going to blame China before anything is even, it's not even over yet. Which again, we'll get more into as we go through, but the reality of that anybody, anywhere, can pretend that they can start making assumptions, but while this is in the midst of happening, is just ridiculous. And anybody honest out there that are, the virologists, the scientists, they'll all tell you that. There's no way we can start casting blame, and we really never should until we get to the point where we can realize that there was actually malicious action taken and not just some organic thing, which, by the way, I believe we're already there. I think there's enough evidence to suggest that there's been people poking this whole thing and prodding it or simply driving it from the beginning. But nobody can point to anybody definitively yet. But they are, which is pretty stupid. Now, the cable sent to State Department officials on this on Friday laid out details that the circumstances on the ground in China, including the data on their coronavirus cases and their deaths. Now, the local business, as well as the local business environment and transport restrictions. But it also issues guidelines for how U.S. officials should answer questions on or speaking about the coronavirus and the White House's response in relation to China. So it basically, as we always know they do, gives them what they're supposed to say. Now, the talking points appear to have originated, and this is still the article, in the National Security Council. Surprise, surprise. One section of the cable reads, NCS top lines, People's Republic of China, propaganda and disinformation on the Wuhan virus pandemic. Now, soon after, the mainstream media started to spread the new talking points, of course, because that's what they do, right? Now, recognize, guys, this was not talking points given to political or government officials is one thing. We know they do that. Right? That's the reason these State Department officials have their big binders and they flip to the right page. They know what they're supposed to say. But to see the mainstream media respond immediately with the exact same talking points that was shown in this expose shows you that the media are just an extension of the government. They are just another arm of the propaganda machine. That they immediately just clicked in and started giving you the talking points. Now, a Google News search right after this for the search term China cover-up, at that point found almost 500,000 results. Now, recognize in this whole thing that this is the government narrative. Now, that doesn't mean it's false, by the way. It's just as likely as anything else at this point. Well, that's not necessarily true, but it's always any theory right now is still possible of where it came from, including the fact that it was China, right? But what's interesting is that this is clearly the U.S. government narrative. That was their talking points. They even rolled out their propaganda campaign of how to cover up this up, and accuse them of what's going on. So to see all of these independent outlets, and of course it's the certain kinds that are parroting this and running with this and calling anybody else propagandists, while they're the ones literally parroting the government narrative. Think about how crazy that is. And instantaneously 500,000 results for the same talking point. Now, on April 1st, Bloomberg, as you can see, was called in, because he's just totally honest journalist out there, or CEO of it's obviously a propagandist, was called in to reinforce the campaign by attributing the claim of a cover-up of China's case and, the death numbers to a, quote, secret U.S. intelligence report. Because that's great journalism, right? It's always an anonymous source and a U.S. intelligence report that you can't see. Well, the report probably didn't exist at all. Because, in fact, the New York Times reported a day later that the CIA hunt for authentic numbers of deaths in China was still ongoing and, in fact, failing. Yet, so simultaneously, they have all the inside, but then they don't know anything, right? Both are happening simultaneously. Don't you love how they always play both sides? It says, so far, to the frustration of both the White House and the intelligence community, the agencies have been unable to glean more accurate numbers through their collection efforts. This is exactly the point I made in the beginning. So how can you simultaneously argue that they didn't warn you? You didn't tell us it was happening, but yet you're also accusing them of hiding how bad it is. Think about how ridiculous that is. If you're accusing them of hiding how bad it is, that means you think it's bad, but then you simultaneously pretended like you didn't take action because they didn't let us know how bad it was. I mean, what are these guys, children? I mean, they're 6 years old. I mean, this is ridiculous. This is like kindergarten level excuses. Now today, however, both the New York Times as well as the Washington Post report that the U.S. is covering up. The mainstream media is saying they're covering up the numbers of the death of the pandemic within its borders. Now, this made me very suspicious. Why is the mainstream media doing this? In this case, obviously, one side of the two-party paradigm would scream that they're trying to, blame Trump. It's the deep state trying to cover up, which is just, if anyone paying attention can see that this fake resistance between the mainstream media and the two-party paradigm is all meant to keep you thinking there's a battle. If they're doing this, in my opinion, again, that all is my opinion, but in my opinion, if they're saying that there's a cover-up going on, that needs to make you suspicious. And you need to ask yourself what they're trying to achieve with this. Now, there is truth that does sometimes slip out from the mainstream media. So consider both sides of it. But I find that to be suspicious. Now, the New York Times headline reads it reads in the article, the U.S. is undercounting the number of people who have died in the pandemic, experts say. Doctors now believe that some deaths in February and early March were likely misidentified as influenza or only described as pneumonia. It says, even under typical circumstances, public health experts say that it takes months or years to compile data that is as accurate as possible on deaths and infectious outbreaks. Now, there's two things that are said there that are very important. First, do they not realize what they're saying, that some deaths in February and March were likely misidentified? Now, isn't that exactly what people like us were screaming when this first started? Like, just to take it just on surface level, the first thing that's being said in February and March, people like us were saying, look, they're lying. They're saying these are flu and these are actually this. And we were being censored. And they were moving channels and they were shouting you down as conspiracy theorists. And now here's the New York Times months later scooping up the same narrative and saying, look at how good we are at journalism, and writing the same exact thing. Think about how stupid that is. Now take it one step further and realize if they're willing to be like, oh, well, they were misdiagnosed in March and February, why not be like, hey, maybe it was happening in December with all of these obvious cases with the exact same symptoms that leaked out from this BSL-4 lab. I mean, think about how crazy it is that they can't make that leap. And that's conscious. The choice is being made not to just kind of push out a little further. If they're willing to realize that's possible there, why are they so resistant to looking at the obvious thing that's happening in 2019? Even as we get data from Italy and everywhere else that it was happening in 2019. We're talking about COVID 2019 here. That's what it is. Or rather, I quite like Jason Burmas's COVID 1984. That's also quite apropos for what's going on here, but recognize how crazy that is. The fact that they are acknowledging that. And then the other part was that they're saying that it takes months and years to compile the data. Well, you don't say. Well, isn't that exactly why we're not supposed to be accusing anybody at this point? I mean, again, it's crazy, but it's happening all across the board, even from left media, by the way. Now, as Moon of Alabama rightly points out, the U.S. already, quote, covered up COVID-19 casualties by not testing enough. Now, whether that was intentional or not, it clearly was the case. If you are not testing intentionally enough, then you are going to make sure that you're not going to get all the data. And it'll also make sure the numbers look worse and that the death rate looks worse. Now, gee, that wasn't used or anything to push in a lot of fear-based legislation that removes our rights, right? But they did already cover it up by not testing enough. And the U.S. CDC will now do exactly what China has done during the outbreak in the Hubei province. It will now report confirmed cases and the fatalities thereof. Only. Right? That's it. Only confirmed cases and the fatalities that follow. By the way, just so we're clear, that's exactly the so-called cover-up that the U.S. has accused China of. Yeah, that's right. Please don't miss that obvious absurdity that this whole time China covered this up and that's why we weren't prepared, and now the U.S. is doing the exact same thing. It's not a surprise. Anyone watching this channel is going, yes, exactly. We saw that coming. But all the people out there screaming and everyone saying, they're trying to cover it up. How do you not see that your own government is literally doing what they're accusing them of? Just like they're doing the same thing, stealing France's masks, as they accuse M3M of doing the same thing. It's ridiculous. You can't be righteous, outraged about something like that as you're literally doing the same thing. It just makes you a hypocrite, which I think we know by now. Now, another COVID-19 story had been used as we talked about this one to denigrate Iran. This is the Washington Post. You saw this. They mocked the country about how a row of fresh dug graves in Qom were visible from space, as Moon rightly points out, just like everything else, using the same exact satellites they did. Think about how dumb that is, right? They used a satellite to zoom in on these. That's why you could see them from space. They weren't arguing you could see them from the moon. They were arguing with the satellite, you could see them, which when you could see the images, as you can see right on the cover, they're zoomed in. So you're telling me this like you can zoom in on literally everything else on the planet. That was just a really feeble attempt. And of course, it was very quickly disproven and made they look really bad, but they don't care about stuff like that. But we remember this. I talked about this. Now, of course, the rows of graves, quote, visible from space, as they said, are coming to the U.S. itself. Right? The chair of the New York City Council really morosely and, morbidly announced that the casualties of this epidemic will apparently now be temporarily buried in public parks. That's not a joke. Right? But let's make sure we continue to point at Iran and say how horrible they're doing as their situation seems to be getting better. Now, Iran is actually contributing to the research of the disease itself, which shouldn't be a shock. As I've said many times in the past, they're incredibly advanced, despite what the U.S. tries to say about them. Now, a large-scale Iranian study actually found that 3/4 of those who had milder symptoms of COVID-19 reported also, and then I've kind of talked about this similarly, reported a sudden smell and blindness, or rather smell blindness, essentially, and sometimes also a loss of taste. Now, the ability to smell apparently recovered really slowly. Now, the research suggested that the specific type of cells in the olfactory in your nose might be the first place where the COVID-19 virus, or rather the SARS-CoV-2 virus, attacks before it moves on to the throat and then deeper into the body. So they're telling us. I found that fascinating, seeing as how I haven't heard that kind of specific information pretty much anywhere. Even people who did not feel ill, apparently, but were living with the ill members in the family, often reported a loss of smell also. How does that even make sense? Doesn't sound like a normal thing to me.